What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are getting into what's probably, or at least what I would consider to be, one of the greatest X-Men stories ever told. This is God Loves, Man Kills. We're doing part 1. This is actually a graphic novel, 84 pages, split into 4 parts. This story was written back in 1983, and this is Chris Claremont at his best. But there is going to be a moment in this video, this might be a little controversial, but that was the nature of Chris. Well, there'll be a couple moments really, like when the story opens up, it's controversial. But Chris Claremont saw the X-Men as like a soap opera, as opposed to like a traditional superhero team, and so he wrote them that way. And so the story reflects that. So this is classic Chris Claremont, right? So those of you guys who were curious what Chris Claremont's X-Men was like back during the 17 years he was writing it, this is exactly what it was like. This, I think, is like the penultimate X-Men story, like the greatest X-Men story ever. But what this does is this opens up with a couple of kids, all right, like a couple of young kids. And as they're running through, these kids, Mark and Jill, they're basically fleeing for their lives. And it's pretty crazy because we're not initially given an indication. All we really get is this thing where Jill asks about where their parents are, and Mark's response is, well, don't worry about them. They can't help us anymore. And in the middle of them running, Mark is suddenly shot from behind. And that's when you basically realize who's chasing after them, that it's a group called the Purifiers. Now, the Purifiers, I mean, we're going to kind of suspend our knowledge of like what this story is. So if you guys are familiar with this and how it ends, all that kind of stuff, do not spoil anything. Please, for the love of God, do not spoil anything. But the Purifiers are pretty extreme, which is exactly what happens here. And there's a reason why Claremont does this. The statement of these Purifiers is, like we're Purifiers. And if you don't know what our mission is, you should know by now. And so we end up finding out the Purifiers are the ones that killed their parents. And then like chased that, like these kids just flee, just took off for their lives as soon as, their parents had died, like when everything happened. And that's the nature of Claremont writing, right? Like Claremont wouldn't always go through and give us like a beginning, a middle, and an end to a story. He would just pick up in the middle of it and then just go forward towards the end. And it was cool because what it did is it kind of left your imagination to wonder what happened beforehand that led up to that. And so we don't see the parents of these kids killed because the parents being killed is not what's significant. What's significant is the heartless nature of the Purifiers. When they say like, we're going to send you to meet your parents, the response of Mark is, you killed them. And they're like, yeah, and we're going to kill you too. And they shoot him on the spot. They kill him on the spot. And then the little girl, like Jill, starts crying. She's like, why are you doing this? And then she's executed. And the response of the Purifiers is, because you have no right to live. This is callous. I mean, it's the most heinous reason, like the most heinous thing that a person could do. Not only that, just to add icing on the cake, not only that, this takes place in a playground. So the Purifiers take the bodies of the kids, string them up, and leave them for the world to see, for like every young person to see. And it's so dark, and it's so twisted and so screwed up, but that was the nature of Chris Claremont's X-Men. Chris Claremont's X-Men was designed to tell the story of a persecuted group, and that was the reason why the X-Men were so impactful back then, because it wasn't like the X-Men were just stand-ins for African Americans. They were stand-ins for like any group that had ever been persecuted, that felt they'd been persecuted and were legitimately persecuted. That's really what this was about. And so instead of, young people finding these kids' bodies strung up, instead, after the Purifiers make their escape, Magneto arrives. And Magneto's there and witnesses what had gone on, or at least is aware that these kids had been executed. He wasn't privy to like the entire goings on of the Purifiers and what they had done. But for Magneto, this is crushing. This is absolutely devastating. Now, this is also kind of a big deal. And the reason why is because when it came to Claremont, if he wasn't picking up stories in the middle of everything, he was setting the groundwork for what would come later. And so it was not uncommon to see Chris Claremont start a theme and then finish it like 5 years later, because he had like all this time. That's one of the reasons why when Claremont just abruptly left in like 1992, that it was such a huge blow to Marvel, because he had like all these plot threads that had been going on that all had to be wrapped up in a matter of like 6 months to a year. But with this theme here, this takes place about 3 years before Uncanny X-Men number 200. And for those of you guys who don't know what that means, that's the point when Magneto takes over leadership of the X-Men and then starts leading the New Mutants. And so that was basically, Chris Claremont's way of revitalizing his character and turning him into a good guy. But for Magneto, this is devastating to him because he has all this power, right? Like the power over magnetism, like over the electromagnetic spectrum. He has all this power. He can shift the Earth's poles. He can issue an EMP, like emit an EMP that'll take down power to the planet. There's all these things that he could do. But despite all that power, there's nothing he could do to save these kids. There's nothing he could have done to save their lives. And so that's why it's so crushing, is because he's like always one step behind them. And so from here, we switch over to the Stryker building, Stryker Worldwide, as it's referred to, which is the head of William Stryker himself and the Stryker Crusade. Now, this is when his character's first introduced. And for those of you guys who don't know, William Stryker is a religious fundamentalist. He's extreme. Here's a really good way to picture William Stryker. Imagine the plot to Handmaid's Tale, but it's mutants instead of women. essentially. But nonetheless, he's very religiously motivated. And the Stryker crusade is literally a crusade against mutant kind. But up to this point, it's largely been pot shots. It's been shots on like a mutant here, a mutant there. What Stryker's looking for are big fish. And he's looking for the X-Men. And that's why he has Bess, his basically his secretary, grabbing like all these little recording tapes, these devices that show what the X-Men are capable of. They kind of highlight their powers and what they're able to do, and then brings them all in for William Stryker to analyze, because what he's doing is essentially sitting down and trying to plot a way to take out the X-Men. And so it's interesting here, because one of the things that he really talks about, at least one of the things that's kind of hit on, is that in his mind, Charles Xavier is the go-to guy. Charles Xavier is the guy that needs to be taken out. He's the leader of the X-Men. To take him down would be a massive blow against the X-Men roster itself, against like mutant kind as a whole, because he's such a public figure. Now, of course, this also coincides with him going to a debate with Charles Xavier, at the ABC studio. So it's actually kind of a cool little thing here. But at this point, we switch over to an encounter, a really kind of a bar fight, basically, between Kitty Pryde and a kid named Danny. Now, Kitty Pryde facing off against Danny, this is basically one of those things that you didn't see all the time, but it was kind of a coming of age scenario. And the reason why I say that is because when Kitty Pryde was introduced to Marvel Comics and she was made part of the X-Men by Chris Claremont, she was very, very, very young. She was somewhere like 13 or 15 years old or something along those lines, but she was a young girl who was coming into her own, who was basically understanding what it meant to like grow up and become a woman and different things like that. And that's why the character of Storm was brought in as a kind of surrogate mother for Kitty Pryde. So she could basically raise her, teach her how to walk, how to talk, how to conduct herself in a womanly way, and also walk her through a lot of the experiences that women go through as their bodies are beginning to grow and as they're going through the whole, experience of growing up and heartbreak and their bodies are changing and so on and so forth. And so with all that happening, there's also another character here named Stevie Hunter. Now with this whole fight that breaks out, it's kind of interesting because it's obvious Danny had basically been running off at the mouth, and we don't initially know what had happened. So you kind of have a handful of people who are here in this location at the same time, right? Like you have Stevie Hunter, you have Colossus, and they're watching the events unfold. Now in this instance, you basically have Colossus who kind of breaks up the fight, and you've got Stevie Hunter who comes out and says, what in the heck is going on here? And that's when we end up finding out that Danny and his family are part of the Stryker crusade. And this is actually a brilliant maneuver by William Stryker. If what he's looking to do is launch a crusade against mutant kind, you do not do it yourself. You get everybody else in society to do it for you. If American people are good at anything, it's shunting blame to someone else and say, well, it's not my fault. The news made me do it, or like Jodie Foster told me to do it, or something like that. But American people are really good at like blaming others and then just kind of absolving themselves of responsibility and saying, well, I'm only human, I make mistakes. And so that's one of the reasons why it's such a genius move, because it's the nature of people to do that. Get the average American to criminalize mutants, to demonize mutants, and then you've got a walking, talking army of some 200 million people who are your army that are going to work on your behalf to take down a million mutants who exist in the United States. It's a genius maneuver, but this is also one of the more controversial moments, because in the midst of all this, Stevie basically tells Kitty Pryde, you have to let it go. The guy's just saying things because he's an asshole, but like you have to let it just kind of roll off you. And the response of Kitty Pryde is, would you take the same stance if she called you an N-bomb lover? I'm not going to say it, but if she called you that, would you do that? When this happened, when this was published, I was 2 years old at the time. I wasn't reading comics when this, I'm sorry, I wasn't even born when this came out. But like looking back at like the history of comics, when this happened, when this was put into a comic book, it was huge. It was massive. It was like, you didn't do that. You didn't do this. In the history of publishing comics, while African Americans may have been depicted certain ways, while like the step and fetch it mentality of like how people viewed African Americans was a part of how African Americans were drawn in comics, you didn't drop the N-bomb in a comic book. That's just not something that you did. And when Chris Claremont did this, it was a gamble. It was a very, very, very dangerous game, but it's not designed for the purpose of just throwing it out there and just saying, yep, N-bomb. It's not designed to say that. Instead, what it's designed to do is show the reality of the situation that the X-Men live in, a persecuted group. It's a very significant moment in this story. I don't know if I can really emphasize how important it is, but it's one of those things, because when Kitty Pryde runs off, the response of Colossus is, look, Stevie, you can't take it too personal. She's upset here. She didn't mean what she said. And the response to Stevie is, actually she did. She really did. Like she really meant that, because it's true. It is a definitive statement. Would Stevie have felt the same way if a different phrase had been thrown out? Instead of mutie lover, it was the N-bomb lover. And so it's a very interesting thing, because it was kind of Chris Claremont's critique of people that like, well, so long as they're not insulting my group, then I don't really care what it is that they say. It's a striking statement to make. But of course, while this is all going on, it's all being observed by purifiers. Now, the initial response to the purifiers is they're pretty extreme, because one of them is just like, well, she's a mutie lover, kill her. Like, I mean, we should just get rid of her. Anybody who is a mutant or anybody who sympathizes with them needs to be taken out. You know, they're evil, they're bad, we have to get rid of them. And so that's when you start going into the debate that takes place between Charles Xavier and William Stryker. And the debate is cut short relatively fast in the sense that as they're going through and debating, it's clearly one-sided. And there's a lot of things that hit in on this. For example, when William Stryker is talking to Charles Xavier, he quotes a statement that came from Senator Robert Kelly's Committee on Mutant Affairs. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that is, this takes place during the events of Project Wide Awake, when the sitting president at the time was running for re-election. Senator Robert Kelly was staunchly anti-mutant and basically pushed the hand of the president by running on the campaign of saying, well, I'm against mutants. And so like mutants are credible and they're a dangerous threat. Senator Robert Kelly used that and ran on that campaign platform, which meant the president had to do it as well. And so the president in turn launched Project Wide Awake. The NSA, the FBI, the CIA, various state and local police departments, sheriff's departments, so on and so forth, all basically finding a way to categorize, quantify, and to control the mutant threat. That's what the whole thing was. This committee on mutant affairs was part of Senator Robert Kelly's campaign. And so that was the whole idea, was to find a way to control mutants. And when this report came out, this report was mutants are legitimately dangerous. They are people with extraordinary powers, some of whom cannot control the powers they have. And because they can't control them, they are in and of themselves a credible threat. For those who can control them, how do we keep them from killing all of us? That makes them a credible threat. And for the ones who seek to use their powers for good, there's simply not enough of them to keep the ones who will use them for evil in check. So we can't trust them to police themselves. And so again, it was kind of building this wall, building this wall that set the X-Men and set mutants in brick by brick by brick to kind of isolate them and to keep them segregated, to say they're inherently bad guys. And so it's kind of crazy here because you have like people behind the scenes, you know, like the guys in the rooms who are watching everything unfold, the people who are working at the news station, and their stance is, yeah, but with all this stuff that William Stryker's saying, it's absolutely terrifying here. But with William Stryker saying things like, well, mutants are a credible threat, mutants are dangerous, mutants are people who need to be eliminated because, they are dangerous to the rest of American society. It's very much McCarthyism. It's very much World War II era Germany. This is a group of people who are bad, and I have deemed them to be bad, and we say they're bad for arbitrary standards. Therefore, we must contain and control them, if not just outright eliminate them. It's calling for the deaths of millions of people. And it's a terrifying scenario because where people look at that, where you have like members of the news who are looking at this, you have the X-Men looking at this, and even when the whole debate is done and Charles Xavier wasn't able to make all his points, when he talks to Cyclops and says, I think that went poorly, Cyclops' response is, absolutely, because you played to people's reason, you played to people's logic, but William Stryker played to their fears. And if anything, fear is one of the most powerful emotions ever. When people are afraid, they will do whatever they need to do. They'll believe whatever they want to believe in order to make that fear go away. And so if William Stryker is sitting on television and he's saying, well, mutants are scary, man. A mutant could be your child, or maybe your child goes to school with a mutant, and then they do something and just wipe out all the kids in the classroom. It's fear-mongering. And because people are so easily terrified, they buy into it. And where Charles Xavier tries to talk reason to it, it doesn't work. It does not work because Charles Xavier looks imposing. Charles Xavier looks scary. And because of that, William Stryker played on that and ultimately won the perceptions of people. And so in response to this, the X-Men are kind of like, okay, look, we don't want to have anything to do with this right now. We're all going to go work out. And so for the next little while, the X-Men are just working out in the danger room, literally just going through and it's really kind of Chris Claremont showcasing their powers and what they can do and what their strengths and weaknesses are and so on and so forth. And that while all that's going on, the Purifiers launched their campaign. They launched their ambush on Charles Xavier and Storm and Cyclops. And this is one of the important things to bear in mind. When it comes to the Purifiers, they're well organized. They're not just like a bunch of crazy guys, like not a bunch of like crazy hicks or like hobos or, nonsensical people with ridiculous beliefs who are just running around with guns like Herderger, mutants bad. Like that's not what they are. Like they're very structured, they're very organized, but more so than that, the Purifiers are anybody. The Purifiers are like bank accountants, businessmen and businesswomen, politicians. They're designed to be a stand-in for the Klan. They could be anyone in your town. You could walk by a Purifier and never know. That's what makes them so dangerous because they're so well organized, so well hidden. And when they launch their attack against Professor Xavier and Cyclops and Storm, it is with dangerous precision. They shoot as they need to. They take them out as they need to. It's fast and swift. I mean, it happens in the blink of an eye. And so from there, you end up having, the X-Men who are kind of, recuperating from their workout and so on and so forth. And, the phone rings, Nightcrawler picks it up, and Nightcrawler basically gets the call in saying that Professor Xavier and Cyclops and Storm have all been killed. Okay, so continuing on with God Loves Man Kills. Again, this is one of my favorite stories, guys. I mean, I love God Loves Man Kills. And a lot of you guys really seem to enjoy it too. This old style of writing, very, very soap opera-like, character focused. You know, he writes action, but it was focused more on the nature of the characters themselves. Now, here's the thing. In the aftermath of the death of Xavier, or at least the perceived death of Xavier, Cyclops, and Storm, this sends the X-Men in a lot of ways into disarray. Now, this is one of the important things to also bear in mind too. When it came to how the X-Men were done by Claremont, one of the things that he established very, very early on is that they were very much autonomous. They did not rely explicitly on Xavier to get their orders. And in fact, this is kind of what the X-Men had been training for. When Claremont wrote these stories, the idea was there will come a time eventually when Xavier is killed or Xavier is removed from the landscape, and the X-Men have to be able to know how to function accordingly. Now, the other half of this is Kitty Pryde. Now, Kitty Pryde as a character, we talked about her a little bit, you know, in the previous videos, but I want to focus a little bit more on her in this one. Kitty Pryde, when she was brought into the X-Men, she was really designed to be like the young reader's kind of entryway into the X-Men mythos. And what I mean by that is Claremont was very, very good at writing characters in such a way to where they were relatable. And so when you looked at Wolverine, he was obviously a character who had been written in such a way that he'd been around for a long time, like for quite some time, and he'd seen and done a lot of things. And so with that having been the case, then it kind of turned into, okay, so like he's the guy we can follow to kind of get like the backstory of what's going on with regards to like what's been happening around the planet. His backstory was ambiguous as hell, but with regards to what was going on behind the scenes, that was kind of a way to feed into that. You looked at Cyclops and it was like, okay, what if we were like the leader of the team? Xavier was the teacher, Jean Grey was, well, she was the cheerleader more or less under Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and then she became the one who was sort of coming into her own under Claremont, kind of, you know, rising and becoming something a little more prominent, sort of shooting up in the ranks. But Kitty Pryde was the one who was like, if you're brand new to X-Men, then like Kitty Pryde's the character you follow, because she was brand new to the X-Men. She was just some young, wide-eyed kid who was brought onto the team, and she was learning what it meant to be an X-Man as she fought alongside the X-Men. And so she was learning about her powers, but she was also learning what it meant to become a woman when she was being taught these various things from Storm and Stevie Ray and so on and so forth. Her character received a lot of emphasis in the fact that she was experiencing a lot of tough times at a very young age. She was going through like all the puberty stages that young kids go through. At the same time, she was falling in love. She had a huge thing for Colossus, and she was kind of learning her place in the bigger picture. And so the idea of Professor X and Cyclops and Storm being killed is really kind of like a huge thing for her, because really like the mentor that she's been learning from are really like perishing around her. And so it's kind of a big thing, because it's like, yes, this is the price we pay for being an X-Man, but it's not something that you're really prepared for even when it happens. Now, as she's going through and kind of musing to herself when she's talking to like Ileana Rasputin, the younger sister of Colossus, she really just kind of goes off on her own, does her own thinking, and then comes across what's essentially like a spy camera belonging to the Purifiers. And again, the Purifiers are spying on the X-Men and have been for quite some time. And so at this point, we shift over to Wolverine and we shift over to Colossus. Now, this is one of the big things about how Wolverine was written back then. It's something that you don't really see anymore with his character. Wolverine was written as a character where again, you know, Chris Claremont sat down and said, this guy's been around for a long time. When Wolverine was part of Team X, when he was part of that Black Ops wet work team working for the CIA, I mean, they took out political officials, they took out political rivals, they toppled governments, they did all kinds of things. And so Wolverine became very, 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 very good at staging crime scenes. And so when he goes over here with Colossus and he starts sniffing around and he starts looking at what's going on, right off the bat, he says, this is not what it looks like. They weren't killed. They were taken from here. And one of the big questions that's asked is, how do you know this? Is like, one, I've staged enough crime scenes in my life to know what a fake crime scene looks at. But not only that, the bodies they found here are not the bodies of Storm and Cyclops and Xavier, because they don't smell the same. The nose knows. The scent is off. At the same time, you've got Wolverine kind of looking around the area, kind of putting his Black Ops experience to use, really like his longevity to use. You've got Nightcrawler who's analyzing everything, and they come up on the idea, there are guys who are sitting in this car over there, and they're basically watching this, they're watching the crime scene. They're looking to see what happens. And so those guys have to be in on it. And that's when Wolverine kind of picks up on the idea they're involved in this somehow. And so you end up having Nightcrawler who shows up, you have Wolverine who dons the costume, you've got Colossus who arrives, and they try to run him over. And one of the girls is basically taken, one of the folks is taken out, the car explodes in a fiery crash, and like two of the guys are rescued. Now, this is one of the things that Claremont was big on. He never shied away from killing people. He never shied away from like the X-Men basically killing people. They wouldn't do it out of malice. The X-Men wouldn't just be like, you know what, I'm tired of you, and then just kill him. You didn't really see it all that often. It would be one of these things where like, it was just collateral damage. But it really went towards focusing on the X-Men themselves, because then it's like, how does a team that's basically a peacekeeping group, how do they handle, like by their own action, getting someone killed? It went really, really, really well in hand with everything that was going on in terms of focusing on like the nature of the character development. Now, where in turn, a couple of these guys are rescued from this fire, you end up having Magneto who who steps in, who literally like dismantles their suits and turns them into cocoons of sorts and locks them in. Now, right off the bat, the X-Men are just like, bad guy. And they respond by intending to take out Magneto, but Magneto responds by saying, I'm not here as an enemy. I'm here as an ally. Now, this is important because again, this goes into the nature of Magneto becoming somewhat of a good guy. Now, that's one of the cool things about this is he's, the way he's drawn, the way he speaks, he's a guy that comes to this with experience. He's made to be very, very human, not some guy who's like, I have magnetism powers. That's not really how he was done back then. Magneto's a guy who hates humans, but in one of these instances, it's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There is a group out there that is hunting down mutants mercilessly. They're killing them everywhere they find them, and they're not taking prisoners. They're taking, no quarter is being offered here. And so it's really kind of like a war on mutant kind. Magneto becomes an ally of the X-Men. And it's kind of cool the way this whole thing plays out, because then you end up having Kitty Pryde who kind of stows away. When these back at the Xavier Institute, when these Purifiers come back to pick up their camera, Kitty Pryde sort of stows away, but the Purifiers are ready for them. And that's one of the things to bear in mind. For her, she's inexperienced. If this had been like Colossus, if it had been, especially if Cyclops were here, it would have been a more diplomatic approach. Diplomatic insofar, probably a more stealthy approach is a better word to use. It would have been like, we can't go in guns blazing. They have to be prepared for us. If they were able to successfully capture Xavier and Cyclops and Storm, they had to have been prepared for us. And if they were prepared for us, it means they understand how our powers work and they know how we function as a team. Kitty Pryde is not that well versed. She just kind of shows up, she tries to stow away, and immediately she's captured by the Purifiers. And so while they're basically leaving with Kitty Pryde, you end up having the X-Men who were showing up with the other Purifiers. Now, this is a really, really cool moment here, because when it comes to this kind of situation, Claremont again focused on the darker side of the X-Men, the fact that they were willing to do things that would tote the line of what it meant to be a good guy and sometimes just walk across it entirely. When you're Wolverine and you've been in the trenches and you've done some pretty shady things, you don't really shy away from saying like, hey, we're probably gonna have to kill some folks. We're gonna have to get our hands dirty. He doesn't mind doing that. It's the nature of what he does. And so where these Purifiers kind of refuse to talk, where they say like, we're not worried about this, Wolverine kind of pops his claws, but at the end of the day, they know it's taunting, because all Wolverine can really do is like kill them. It's the nature of what he does. He kind of pops his claws and he can scratch them a little bit, but with adamantium, Wolverine doesn't really have a whole lot of finesse. It's just kind of like, I'm going to slash you and I'm going to kill you, and that's really it. There's not a whole lot he can do here. He's not nuanced. And so instead, where Wolverine kind of tries to torture them and literally they hold their guns, Magneto's response is, we have to go to the darker side of things here. We have to do some bad things. And so let me be the bad guy who does bad things. And so what Magneto basically does here, he literally pulls apart the metal cocoons that he wrapped these guys in and starts putting, like literally entering them into their bodies. It's like putting bamboo reeds under their fingernails. He's torturing them. He's torturing them for information. And where the other X-Men look on and they're just kind of like, is this really something that we should do? Wolverine's response is, absolutely. This is absolutely what we need to do. These guys cannot be reasoned with. You cannot get them to talk. Fear will not work. The only thing they will answer to is pain. Pain in the most extreme form. And it's literally just shards of metal being twisted through their physical bodies, leaving them in a state where they'll say anything to make the pain stop. And that's one of these crazy things. Magneto's well known to the Purifiers. He's well known as a guy who will do whatever it takes in order to get the information that he wants. And in this instance, instead of like bombarding them with psychic torture, physical pain is what's the worst, because psychic torture is you just kind of like screwing up a person's mind, and in a lot of ways it can be worse. But physical pain from the master of magnetism sliding, shards of metal into your body, like just in and out of your body, it's the most extreme form of pain that they could possibly imagine. And so they'll tell the truth, because what this means is that if they don't, the pain will keep coming. They'll keep them here, and then in turn go and investigate their information. And if their information proves to be false, they'll come right back, and the pain will be worse the second time around than it was the first, because not only do they want the information, they're also pissed off this guy lied. So again, it's pretty dark and it's pretty twisted, but it's the nature of things. Okay, so picking up with really the conclusion of God Loves Man Kills, which by the way, I've got a cold, you guys can probably tell. I'm actually getting over it, but still, it sucks. But anyway, picking up with God Loves Man Kills, the conclusion of all this, we switch over to Charles Xavier. Now, this is where you really start to see how screwed up William Stryker is. When this happens, we basically switch over to Manhattan to the headquarters of the Stryker Crusade, and one of the things that they say, that really kind of gets thrown in here is, and then they bring him under the place Golgotha, and they crucify him. That is a testament to Jesus. Jesus was crucified there. Now, the idea behind this is that when this happens with Xavier, with him being crucified, it's all the X-Men who show up and literally start like stabbing him, jabbing at him, ripping his heart out. It's all these forms forms of psychic torture. Now, in reality, this is not truly happening, but this is the worst conceivable nightmare for Charles Xavier. And that's one of the things to bear in mind, is that for Charles Xavier, there's really kind of like two aspects of what it is that he does. You've got the X-Men, so basically creating like a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, and then you've got the X-Men as his actual children, is really how he sees them. And the way that William Stryker plays this out is that in the midst of all this torture and this place of darkness and pain, that he kind of shows up as a savior of sorts. It says, look, surrender yourself to me and everything will be okay. Give yourself to me, and in turn, I will lead you to paradise. Very much presenting himself as God, or as a Christ-like figure, because it really fits well within the religious themes of William Stryker and the role that he plays. The issue with this is that Charles Xavier resists to a degree. Now, it's one of these things where this has been going on for 15 hours, and so there's no sight, there's really no end in sight, and that's the nature of William Stryker. When he goes in and he starts talking to Philip Ramsey, who's like a psychologist, who's the one implementing all this psychological torture, the results here are that Xavier is slowly being broken down. Now, the other part of this, of course, is that you have Cyclops and you have Storm, and the question that's asked of them is, why are you doing this? Like, what's the basis behind all this in the first place? Do you really just hate mutants that much? And the response of William Stryker is kind of amazing here. And this is where you start to see, Fox having drawn their elements from his character, but not really taking the next step for fear of pissing off all the Christians. But the idea here is that originally William Stryker was a member of the US military. And when he had finally finished his leave, or I guess his tour basically, or at least when he was on break from his tour, he and his wife were traveling when, of course, she was pregnant, and then began to give birth to their child. In the midst of this car wreck that they experienced, when the birthing process began and the child was actually born, William Stryker realized it was a mutant, and believing that it was, had killed the child. Now, when his wife asked for the baby, he in turn broke her neck. This is a man that killed his own wife and child. It's extreme. Now, where this originally stemmed from fear, he in turn got into the vehicle and then lit a match, intending to kill all of them in the process, and he was blown free from the entire explosion. And in his mind, he rationalized, God saved me from this fate. God wants me to go forward and destroy all these mutants. Now, the other part of this is this goes into a guy by the name of Fred Duncan. Now, Fred Duncan was a character who was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and he originally appeared when the Vanisher first showed up. When it comes to Marvel, this is one of the things to bear in mind. When it comes to Marvel Comics, you oftentimes see liaisons, right? Like when X-Factor not really when they first showed up. When the original X-Men left X-Factor and a new team was brought in the early 1990s, you got Valerie Cooper, and then you got Forge. You basically had these characters who were like liaisons between X-Factor and the federal government. With Fred Duncan, he was a liaison between the FBI and the X-Men themselves. And so it was kind of like a give and take here. He'd be one of those guys who would basically warn the X-Men if something was coming down the pipe that could threaten them or they were going to be needed. But he was also a character who the X-Men would relay information to on their various goings on and things that were happening. Now, where this was kind of like a tenuous relationship, and where Fred Duncan was more of a friend of Xavier, and the rest of the X-Men didn't truly trust him, when events began to unfold, like the formation of Project Wide Awake, when you started getting into the federal government basically using the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, all these various organizations for the purpose of spying on the mutant threat, trying to contain and control it, Fred Duncan would pass information to the X-Men and basically become more of a friend, kind of giving them a step ahead of what the federal government was doing. But the fact remains here, this is one of the things that William Stryker was doing, was that he had a member of the Stryker Crusade working in the FBI, and that member was taking information that was being gained by Fred Duncan and pulling it in and giving it to William Stryker. The Purifiers are all over the place. Anybody could be one of these guys. It's like a modern day clan, except they don't wear white hoods and white outfits and all that kind of crazy stuff. So again, it's pretty extreme and it's pretty dark. Now, what we also have to remember here is that Kitty Pryde had basically stowed away alongside with the Purifiers when they showed up at the Xavier Institute while the rest of the X-Men were away, and kidnapped Ileana Rasputin, the sister of Colossus. And so when this happened, of course, Kitty Pryde's location was the Purifiers were aware that she was there. They essentially used nerve gas to knock her out. But when they actually get to the location, when the question is asked, to William Stryker, we have Ileana Rasputin, what do you want us to do with Kitty Pryde? He simply says, kill her. The guy's willing to kill a 15-year-old girl. It's extreme. Now, of course, Kitty Pryde makes her escape, but the problem with this is that she's still suffering from the effects of nerve gas, which hasn't totally worn off yet. And so her phasing powers aren't at 100%. She's literally just kind of fleeing for her life. And so in this instance, when Kitty Pryde basically makes her way into the Bronx, she ends up running across a gang. And of course, we know what the gang's intentions are with her, despite the fact that she's 15 years old. And so when they try to make a move and they basically try to force themselves on her, of course, you have Anne from the Purifiers who shows up, who in turn looks to kill Kitty Pryde. Now, this is the nature of the Purifiers. They'll kill whoever gets in their way. It doesn't matter who you are. If you are in the way of them and a mutant, they will kill you to get to that mutant. It's how extreme they are. And so, of course, Anne in turn kills all the gang members. Kitty Pryde manages to make her escape, and then, of course, calls Nightcrawler back at the Xavier Institute and says, hey, here's where I am. And then, of course, there's a massive explosion. The Purifiers are still chasing her down. That's the intensity that goes goes on here. Yes, the Purifiers are human. Yes, they tire, but Kitty Pryde's in a weakened state. They will constantly chase her until they finally get a hold of her. It's the nature of who they are. And so in this moment, you know, when she finally manages to stow away aboard a subway train and manages to make her escape, the Purifiers track her down, they chase her down, they try to take her out, and of course, that leads to the arrival of Colossus, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, the whole 9 yards, and they basically take out these Purifiers. And of course, is a survivor. She manages to make her escape, but it's still pretty extreme, because then you switch back over to Charles Xavier, and this is where the continued mental torture of Charles Xavier has begun to finally take its toll. That the psychic torture he's been experiencing has slowly been eroding away at his mental blocks, to the point that when William Stryker finally steps in and says, "Are you ready to embrace the word of God? Are you ready to become a believer in the power of Christ?" That in turn, Xavier's response is, "Yes." And then William Stryker says, "Then kill Cyclops and Storm." And where he initially resists, what William Stryker does here is he says, "Only those who are worthy will be accepted. Only those who are worthy will be viewed by me as being worthy. So if you truly want to attain the splendor of heaven, if you truly want to attain something greater, then you have to kill them." And Charles Xavier says, "Okay." And he kills Cyclops and Storm. And it is mind-blowing. When this happened, like I remember reading this, X-Men the Animated Series, my dad introduced me to comic books, and I in turn start reading everything I possibly can. When I'm reading this, oh, it blew me away. And it's like, okay, Xavier's ready. Because what they're gonna do is they're gonna go to this garden, this massive event that they're putting on, like a giant church sermon. And what's gonna go on behind the scenes is Xavier's mind is gonna pick up everyone who's a mutant, and all those mutants who are there are gonna be killed by Xavier. And so where you end up having like Philip Ramsey, who basically gets in his vehicle and leaves to go back and change, get a shower, so on and so forth, and then head to the garden proper, he's intercepted by Kurt Wagner. Now, this is where Nightcrawler begins to show his darker half, where he really is more of like a loving and a gentle character. When it comes down to it, Nightcrawler can scare the hell out of you because of how he looks. I mean, if you've got someone that shows up to you looking like a devil and then starts teleporting you around the world, it's gonna scare you out of your wits. And that's literally what he does with Philip. He snatches him up and says like, "I'm here to inflict pain and torture. I'm here to take all the nightmares you've ever had of what mutants are, and I'm here to bring them to your doorstep. We have a lot of ways that we can make you hurt. We have even more ways that we can kill you. So which one is it gonna be? Do you want to hurt or do you want to die?" And so ultimately, Philip Ramsey hands the information over. And so where you end up having, you know, the bodies of Storm and Cyclops, who were unceremoniously thrown onto these beds and then carted down to the incinerators, you end up having like the elevator, which just like jerks up to the top because they have Ileana Rasputin going with them, you know, and so like it literally jerks to the top and just plunges out of the building, only for us to find out Magneto was the one who's doing it. And so Anne the Purifier jumps out of the elevator, grabs onto the edge of the building, flees for her life, and then you have like Wolverine who sits down and says, "They're not dead." Now, to be honest, this is a bit of a MacGuffin, but that's the nature of Chris Claremont storytelling, right? Like Chris Claremont doesn't tell this for shock value. With Chris Claremont, when he wrote these stories, the way that when he did things like this, it was designed for the purpose to show how bad things were. It's designed to show you how broken Charles Xavier is. Well, then the question becomes, if they're not dead, why are they not dead? And the answer to this question is because Charles Xavier is still fighting back. There's still some part of him that's fighting back as best he can. And so what he had essentially done was shut down the minds of Storm and Cyclops. As far as anybody out there using machines to read them was aware, they were dead because their mental patterns were operating at such a low rate that they would seem to be dead. It's a cool little thing to see because it shows the bond between Xavier and the X-Men, that it's this unbreakable thing. That Xavier, while he has done some shady things, while he has done some things that maybe seem like betrayal, the one thing he would not do is kill his own X-Men. Stories like these are why events like Avengers vs. X-Men, when Cyclops kills Xavier, is so significant. But with Xavier being in the mental state that William Stryker expects him to be in, that's one of the important things to bear in mind. Xavier is fighting in such a way to where subconsciously he'll preserve the X-Men, but you're talking about the rest of the mutant population. And Xavier does not care for the rest of the mutant population the way he does care for the X-Men. And so this is still a tangible possibility that Xavier will be brought to the garden, that he'll be put on display for the world to see, that William Stryker will use him to kill all the mutants in this immediate vicinity, turn him into a weapon. And then in turn, like it's really just kind of a test bed. Will this work in this immediate area? And if it will, well then in turn, like I can espouse this and say, see guys, God hates mutants. Look at this. Because no one's gonna know that Xavier is the one that's doing it. It's just gonna be like, hey guys, God hates mutants. Like look at God smiting the mutant population. So again, it's extreme. But remember, that's the nature of William Stryker. While all that's happening, the power of Xavier is being put to work. And all these various mutants are being made to suffer. Their minds are being scrambled. They're really on the verge of being killed. You have Magneto who fights back as best he can, but there's only so much that he can do. One of the things to bear in mind here, though, is the nature of the people who are attending. When it comes to something like this, when it comes to extreme views draw extremists, and extreme views make extremists out of non-extreme people. And so it's literally fear-mongering. It's telling people exactly what they want to hear. That's exactly what William Stryker does here. And it works stupendously, because in a state of desperation, people will believe what they want to believe. And so you've already got people who already have this sort of baseline hatred for the mutant population. William Stryker comes along and says, behold the power of Christ, amplifies that mutant hatred, and then in turn uses that fear to amplify their fear and hate even more. It's one of the best political maneuvers a person can make. So that's one of the reasons why Chris Claremont's storytelling was incredibly political. It was always political. It was never not political, but it was always cool the way that it was done. And so when you have the X-Men basically trying to fight off as best they can, the only people who are being affected here are mutants. And so what this means is that with Charles Xavier's mind working, it's kind of like a beacon. It's kind of a radar. It kind of reveals the hidden mutant population among them, one of whom is Anne, who's actually one of the members of the Purifiers. What her mutant power is, we don't know. We're never told. But William Stryker doesn't care. And so where Anne has been faithful, his best soldier to this point, he pushes her off the platform, she falls and breaks her neck, and that's the end of Anne. This unceremonious end to an otherwise devoted follower who turned out to be a mutant. That's just the way this game gets played. And so as a result, the devices that are being used to kind of amplify the power of Xavier are taken out by Cyclops, and in doing so, that leads to the rest of the X-Men kind of asking the question, well, what do we do now? And the initial response is, well, we can kill William Stryker, but the response of Cyclops is, no, we're not going to kill him. What we're going to do is we're going to discredit him. And that's the best move that he can make. And the reason why is because you're talking about this massive gathering that's being televised all across the world. If the X-Men walked in there and killed him, it would make him a martyr. And so Cyclops walks in and says, we have to debate him. We have to destroy his credibility on TV and reduce his argument down to nothing. That's the best way to win, because winning the hearts and minds of people is not done through physical violence. And so when you have Cyclops who goes in and says, hey, look, we're going to have a debate. We're going to argue with you. His response is like, yes, we're mutants, but like, we're also human beings too. We have abilities, but are our abilities so different from like a world-class astronomer or a master chess player? Are they really that different? These gifts, sure, manifest in a physical way, and some of them are dangerous. But just like any other circumstance, a villain, like a criminal with a handgun, a gangbanger, a doctor that practices euthanasia, whatever the case is, we have an ability, we have a gift, and we can use it for good or evil. There are those of us who use it for evil and those of us who use it for good. But does that mean that every gun owner is a bad guy? Does it mean that every gun owner is a criminal? Of course it doesn't. It means that there are those who own guns and there are those who are going to commit bad acts with them. But just because a person can do a bad thing doesn't mean they will do a bad thing. We are not an inherently evil group of people. But that's the nature of extremist views. Extremist views do not see gray areas. It's a very, very dangerous ideology to have. And because he's cornered in this argument, because of the fact that he's told by Cyclops, look, for all you know, it could be that we're baseline humans and that you're the mutation, that everybody, that people are supposed to be born with powers. Because I mean, Cyclops is really kind of talking out of his ass at that point, but it's like, people are born with powers. You are born without powers. So what if you're the mutation here? And even if that's not the case, we are the next step in human evolution. Men were apes once. And that literally is an affront to everything William Stryker believes. Divine creation. God created heaven, the earth, firmament, all that kind of good stuff. And in his desperation, he does the only thing he knows how to do. He turns to violence. And he literally pulls a gun and points it at Kitty Pryde with the intention of shooting her, and the X-Men stand down. They stand there and do nothing. Because what this does is it shows that the argument of William Stryker has no merit. There's no real ground to it. It's simply him just espousing nonsense under the belief that like people will believe him. And when there's nothing left, when the foundation of his argument is literally destroyed, he turns to violence. Violence is an act of desperation, and it's an act of desperation by desperate men and women. When they have nothing else, they'll turn to violence. The X-Men stand down, and then he's shot by a cop. And one of the cops is just like, he was going to shoot a 15-year-old unarmed child. Not a chance I was going to let that happen. This cop does his duty. He shoots William Stryker and says, the X-Men have done nothing wrong here. The X-Men are victims of an otherwise deranged man who believes that God wants him to kill mutants. This guy was going to kill innocent people. I shot this guy. He's going to go to jail. The X-Men, you're free to go. You're victims of a kidnapping and torture. Just get out of here. And so following that, what this does is this leads to this really, really interesting scenario where you kind of go into this epilogue, and you basically have like the aftermath of all this, and William Stryker's taken to jail and so on and so forth. And the X-Men are talking to Charles Xavier, and Charles Xavier starts to adopt the mindset of Magneto. And this comes out of Charles Xavier's experience. The guy was tortured consistently for almost a full 24 hours. He was psychologically tortured, and it almost destroyed his perception of humanity. What happens when you encounter a man who is so fanatical, who is so far gone, that his belief system is derived from faith, derived from God, this incorruptible, unshakable thing. And he says, because of my faith, because of this unshakable belief, I am going to wipe out the entirety of the mutant population. What do you do in the face of that? Like, how do you function in the face of that? What William Stryker showed Charles Xavier is that there are men out there whose hearts and minds cannot be changed. They cannot be reasoned with. They can't be bargained with. There's nothing you can do to convince them that their way is the wrong way, that the only way to really stop them is to kill them. And what that's done is it's destroyed Charles Xavier's perception that a peaceful coexistence can be achieved. That he sits in this chair and says, maybe Magneto's right. Maybe there really is no way to save the hearts and minds of men, because William Stryker was a religious fundamentalist. But what happens when you have men and women in positions of power that cannot be touched, they cannot be stopped, and sometimes can't even be seen because their presences are so secretive? What happens when they're the ones whose hearts and minds can't be changed? What happens when a person decides they want to press the nuclear option? What happens when you run into that situation? How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? And Xavier's response is, you can't. William Stryker showed me that there are people out there who just can't be convinced. And if they can't be convinced, then maybe this is a fruitless effort. Maybe it's pointless. But the argument Cyclops makes here is, no, it's not. William Stryker was one man. What do you have to say about the cop who shot him? What do you have to say about those who began to look at what William Stryker was saying and saying, maybe this really is too extreme. Like, maybe this really is too hardcore. Like, I'm all against stopping those who are dangerous, but like, I'm not in favor of killing mutant children who haven't done anything wrong. You know, like, what do you say to those guys? What do you say to them? Are you going to look that cop in the eye and you're going to say, thanks for saving my life, but like, you're still a credible threat though? Like, are you really going to say that? William Stryker was an extremist example, but for every extreme William Stryker out there, there's a cop. There's that one cop with red hair who saved his life. And so because of that, like, you can't take it as extremes. It's really Cyclops making the argument of saying, this is how you become a William Stryker. Sure, you're not a religious fundamentalist who believes that God wants you to kill mutants, but you are becoming like Magneto. And Magneto really is, at the end of the day, nothing more than another William Stryker, but on the opposite end of the spectrum. And that's kind of a mind-blowing perception to throw out there, to see Magneto put in that light, but to kind of make the argument that he really kind of is the same way. And so with his faith kind of being shaken, Xavier goes forward, really kind of having to ask himself some very serious questions. Is it worth it to continue this peaceful coexistence? You know, is it that Cyclops is better suited to leave the X-Men than he is? There's these different things that go in there, these different arguments that are made. And what this does is it kind of feeds into the future of the X-Men stories under Chris Claremont going forward for the next 7 years until Claremont leaves, and helps to kind of build things even further. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.